It's not a good way to run a government. It doesn't build good relationships. It doesn't build good long-term decision-making. And the people there elect their own mayors, county commissioners, state legislators, governors. Those people should be involved in decision-making in what happens in the areas.
So is there anything that the federal government can do to help states control more of their land?
Yeah. The reason states don't control this land is because of the federal government. So Congress has jurisdiction over federal land. And we've just held on to it since 1976 when Flipman passed, like you said. Before that, it was the policy of the federal government to dispose of federal land. Now, by 76, we weren't disposing of much of it. You know, in the 1870s, we were. By the 1970s, we weren't doing much of that. And people tell us in the West all the time, it's because these lands were dry. Nobody wanted them, which clearly isn't true.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Welcome to the American Potential Podcast. I'm the host, David Fromm. If you've ever traveled across America, you've seen how beautiful the country is and how each state has its own unique beauty. Conservationists want to protect portions of these lands, but who should be in charge? The states or the federal government? Well, out west, it's a big question, since the federal government controls over 50% of the lands in some states. This didn't happen by accident. Starting in the late 19th century, the government shifted from giving land away to keeping it, passing laws like the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 and the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, which gave the federal government control. Today, 5 agencies manage 615 million acres, or 20% of all U.S. land. So, should Washington still be in control of so much land, or is it time for a change? Today's guest is a congresswoman who represents one of these states and has a degree in agriculture and law. She started her public service career by working for 10 years as a soil conservationist, then becoming a public lands attorney for the Utah Association of Counties and a staff attorney for Washington County Water Conservancy District. Now, representing Utah's 2nd Congressional District, she is the vice chair of the Subcommittee on Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies and sits on other subcommittees dealing with federal lands and resources. Please welcome to the podcast Congresswoman Celeste Maloy, who represents Utah's 2nd Congressional District. Welcome, Congresswoman.
Hi, David.
I believe we're actually we're kind of professionally related in terms of we're almost like professional family in that I took over the podcast here from my good friend Jeff Crank, who's now a congresswoman from from Colorado, and you are Jeff's mentor in Congress.
I'm his mentor. So I was at a dinner recently with somebody who was amazed that I am a mentor because I've only been in Congress a little bit over a year, and they said that there was only one person in Congress who probably needed a mentor less than I did, and it was Jeff Crank. And ironically, I am his mentor. So it works out well that I don't have much experience, but he doesn't need much mentoring.
Well, we always can learn. And I can tell you, I spoke to him about you in particular, and he was enormously complimentary and paid to one of the best compliments that if you know Jeff Crank, one of the best compliments you can probably say is that you're just a regular, good, down to earth person. And that was exactly what he said about you. So,
well, Jeff and I were both staffers. Yeah. So I was legal counsel for my predecessor, and he was a chief of staff on the Hill for 8 years. And I think that's why we get along so well. We both know how the Hill works from the staff side before we were ever elected.
Nice. Well, good. I'm glad we're bringing that experience to bear for our side.
Me too.
Well, and I could talk about experience before we kind of get into today's topic of public land. You worked as a soil conservationist.
I did.
So what do you do in that? And how'd you end up doing that job?
I ended up doing it the way I end up doing most things in my life. A little bit of accident and a lot of luck. I was an undergrad getting my agriculture degree. And one day, one of my professors pointed to a paper on a bulletin board, that's how old I am, and said, there's an internship available you should apply for. And I didn't even know what the NRCS was at that point, but it was an internship and I needed one. It was a paid internship. And so I applied and I became an intern at the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I got to work with farmers and ranchers, and I got trained by guys who had been doing this work for a long time, and I got to be out in the field and doing exciting things, and I really liked it. So when I graduated, they offered me a full-time position doing that in rural southern Utah, and I spent nearly 10 years there, mostly designing irrigation systems for farmers, but doing some range and pasture work and trying to help people who make a living in agriculture use the resources in the most efficient way they can. And I really like that work.
Yeah, I imagine you probably drawn some of that, like having that experience. You can draw on it now when you do the important work that you're doing, your committee assignment. All.
Definitely. In fact, the meeting I had right before we started recording this podcast was with someone I knew from that time who was asking me about how these programs are going to be administered in the future. And it really is helpful to have some background in how the agencies work.
Well, and then you were a public lands attorney, right? And so I imagine that is really also very important, how it has formed a lot of your opinions.
Yeah. So I left soil conservation to go to law school. And when I graduated from law school, I went back to southern Utah and was practicing law as a deputy county attorney, and I was doing public lands work. So then it was me representing the county when they were negotiating or in an adversarial position to federal agencies. And that work has turned out to be really valuable for what I do now.
Yeah.
I talk a lot about how the agencies are too big and they need more accountability. And this is how I came to those conclusions.
Well, so that kind of brings us to today's topic that, we're mostly focused on, which is really public lands. And so in your home state of Utah, which, by the way, is just a stunningly beautiful state. Oh my gosh. I've spent some time there and driven through a lot, especially your neck of the woods in southern Utah. Like, man, I was not prepared for how beautiful that was.
Yeah. Well, I actually represent almost half of the state geographically. So I have northern Utah, southern Utah, the Bonneville Salt Flats, the West Desert. I've got a lot of diversity in my district, and I would put it up against any district in the country as far as scenery goes.
Yeah, I think you're in good standing there. I probably agree partially. I'll tell you, just to tell you a quick story. I was driving out to California. I'm located in the Chicago area, so not quite as scenic. And we're driving out to get my daughter from college. She was in California in college, and we blew out a tire. And I'm trying to remember the town it was in southern Utah. It was one of the better sized towns. It blew out a tire on the highway, and it was about 5 o'clock when everything was going to close. And it was a rental car. You couldn't change it yourself. And this prince of a tow truck driver came and met us, called the heads of the tire place, asked them to stay open. They fixed our tire, and we were able to keep going and not be stranded for a night. And the people couldn't have been nicer and more accommodating. It gave me such a great impression of the people of southern Utah.
I'm glad to hear that. If you remember what the town is, let me know. I may or may not know the truck driver.
I figured as much. I will. I'll have to look that up. So, all right. So 70% of the land in Utah, as my understanding, is controlled by federal agencies. So which agencies are involved, and maybe paint the picture of how they use the land? So
the major land management agencies are the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Reclamation. If only they were the Bureau of Recreation. They play a role too, but most of the land is managed by either BLM or Forest Service. And BLM's mission is to manage for multiple use and sustained yield. Historically, they've managed for timber, grazing, mining, oil and gas, recreation. They really were sort of all of the above agency. Over time, they've gotten more and more restrictive on some of what they call the extractive uses, the ones that people can actually make a living on. Grazing has gotten smaller over the years. Timber has gotten smaller over the years. And so have things like mining and oil and gas. And then the Forest Service has a mission to manage for health of the watershed and production, which means timber. And they've also, over the years, morphed into more of a conservation and recreation sort of mindset. But what Congress told them to be is agencies that manage the land for productivity.
My understanding is that, 70% of the land in Utah being controlled by the federal government is amazing. And then Nevada actually has the most land controlled by the federal government, 80%. So do you know how other Western states feel about not managing the majority of their state land? Is it similar to you in Utah?
It's an interesting mix across the West, actually. I actually grew up in Nevada.
Really?
And yeah, and Nevada has different politics than Utah, where most of the people in Nevada live in Clark County. And I don't know that the people in Clark County realize that most of the rest of the state is federal land. And sorry, I have the same cough everybody in the country's had for weeks this winter. In Nevada, if you're in the rural areas, they want more control of the land. In the urban areas, I don't think people care as much. And that's probably true across a lot of the West. And then most of the public land is in Western states, but not all Western states have the high percentages that Utah and Nevada have. So some of the states that have, 30-ish% public land don't have as many issues as we have, where the majority of our land is federally managed. And probably 20 years ago, the Western states were more united on how they felt about all the public land. And over time, I think all the states have urbanized a little bit more. And so it's not at the forefront of everybody's minds all the time, unless you live in one of those rural areas. And then everything you do is impacted by federal land policy. And even in the urban areas, it's impacted. People just aren't as aware of it. It's not front of mind all the time like it is when you're out in the rural areas.
Well, and I imagine that the way demographics have gone, I mean, you've seen such an explosion of growth in some of the urban areas like Salt Lake City or Las Vegas or a number of other areas that probably does change some dynamics also.
Yeah. I don't think everybody who drives through these states and sees all that open space realizes that the reason it's open space is because it's public land managed by the federal government.
Yeah, I think that's probably absolutely true. So just basically, why should states have more say in what and how the land's being used?
It's just one of those basic principles that applies to just about any topic. Whoever's living the closest to a regulation probably should have the most say in it. If I can regulate somebody else, I'm not going to be as sensitive to how those regulations impact them. So when the Bureau of Land Management, headquartered in Washington, D.C., issues a new manual and says, we want to prioritize conservation over extractive uses, it's a concept they're talking about, but the people in my district live with that decision. If their animal unit months, which is the unit that is used for grazing management, one thing you can count on here on Capitol Hill is that every conversation will get interrupted by loud noises. If their AUMs are going away, if the mines are closing down, if the sawmills are closing down, that impacts families. It also impacts communities. When jobs are lost in these rural communities, the community itself starts to crumble. You have to have a critical mass of jobs in order to keep a community functioning, in order to have a school that can stay open, in order to have a grocery store that can stay open, in order to have a gas station that can stay open. And when people come to these areas to recreate, they don't always think about what the people there do for a living. And I had a conversation just this morning with someone from California who said, we've heard over and over and over that the recreation economy is going to be so good for these areas. But for 20 years of hearing that, we're just not seeing it. What we see is part-time jobs, sometimes seasonal jobs, usually minimum wage jobs, replacing what used to be mining jobs, timber jobs, long-term jobs with benefits that kept families anchored in a community.
Yeah, so maybe can we drill into that? Because I think that's really at the core of what we're talking about here is like when the federal government dictates what this land is used for and starts to restrict, it has a pretty profound economic and social and environmental impact for the region. I mean, what are some other impacts that you see when the government kind of takes what we'd say is a top-down solution rather than listening to the bottom-up solutions?
So there's just a reality about humans that we don't like to be forced to do things. So when somebody comes in and says, this is how your land will be managed, we naturally chafe at that. We naturally rebel against that. And in order for this to work, the locals should have some buy-in. They should have some say. But when you live in a town where things keep happening to you and you're not part of it, if someone comes in and creates a national monument and no one ever talked to anyone there about it, someone comes in and eliminates a use that traditionally your community has been part of, then it creates a friction point where your community is being told what to do by someone who's not part of your community. And I mean, if you study history anywhere in the world, that usually doesn't go well for very long. And we're sort of in denial with Western states that it's happening. But if you live in these communities, I mean, the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in my district was created in 1996 by Bill Clinton. It is still a friction point all these years later, because Bill Clinton came. He actually didn't come. He announced the creation of the monument from the north rim of the Grand Canyon because he knew how unpopular it was going to be. And when President Trump was in office the first time, he changed the boundaries to make that monument smaller at the request of locals. Then President Biden came. He made the monument bigger again. And it's just a controversy that isn't going away. It's not dying. Because when you do something to people against their will, they don't just decide they like it usually. But with land management, we kind of pretend that works. If the bureaucrats force people to do it, we just act like eventually people will decide it's good for them, and it's not happening.
Yeah, I think you really hit on something correct, that the American spirit is such that we don't like to be told what to do. We want to buy into like the benefits of it. I think Americans are pretty reasonable that when they see benefits, they are willing to embrace. But I think that spirit's especially strong in my limited experience out west. So that's
and we're proud of our natural resources in the West. We are proud of our scenery. We love that people come from all over the world to the national parks. We even love that people come and, hike in these remote areas. We're proud to show off our backyard. We just want people to acknowledge that it's our backyard. And what it feels like is that everyone keeps telling us it's the whole world's backyard and we're intruders there. And these places are pristine. We've been living there for a long time and the places are still pristine and nice. Now someone who just discovered it comes in and says, you all need to leave because we're going to protect it for you. And it's not a good way to run a government. It doesn't build good relationships. It doesn't build good long-term decision-making. And the people there elect their own mayors, county commissioners, state legislators, governors. Those people should be involved in decision-making in what happens in the areas.
So is there anything that the federal government can do to help states control more of their land?
Yeah. The reason states don't control this land is because of the federal government. So Congress has jurisdiction over federal land. And we've just held on to it since 1976 when Flipman passed, like you said. Before that, it was the policy of the federal government to dispose of federal land. Now, by 76, we weren't disposing of much of it. In the 1870s, we were. By the 1970s, we weren't doing much of that. And people tell us in the West all the time, it's because these lands were dry. Nobody wanted them, which clearly isn't true. People were there, they were using it. But in our arid areas, you can't use land the same way you can in the Midwest. So the rules, the Homestead Acts, the Timber Acts, all these acts that built up for disposing of land didn't really ever make sense for the lands that are still left. So the land that was easy to settle, that was easy to farm, got homesteaded, it's privatized. Lands that where it was more difficult to make a living stayed in federal hands. And now the states that are the driest got stuck with the most of it, or states that have railroads where they, used railroad disposals to help build the railroads. And then the government changed policy. So through the whole history of this country, if you mixed your sweat with a natural resource and turned it into something, you owned that thing. If you chopped down trees and hewed logs and built a cabin, it was your cabin. If you dammed a stream and made a pond, you used the water from that pond. That's the way our country developed from the time, the people landed in Jamestown. But for those of us in the West, the last places to develop, by then, the ethic had changed across the country, and we had people on the East Coast and in the Midwest who didn't think it was fair to give away that much land, and so we stopped. And the West got caught in the middle, where people had been using the resource. I mean, it's good grazing land, mining land, but we never disposed of it. And so the federal government needs to update policies to reflect that. I mean, we changed the rules in the middle of the game on people in the West.
I'm struck by something that as I host this podcast, and we talk to a lot of different people who are dealing with a myriad of policy issues with the federal government, especially, but even state government. And one of the consistent themes is that, the conflict between, hey, the folks closest to the problem really have the best solutions versus top-down policies or folks who want to tell, whether it be environmental policy, energy policy, education. There's so many different, you pick, it's a theme across policy issues that they want to, there are people who think that I know better than you, the folks closest to the problem, and discount that local knowledge and, kind of feel like there's a more enlightened way to do something. And man, it's just a conflict that occurs time and again. And I actually have some fear that it's eroding, younger generations, that they feel like, they're like government sometimes knows best, or someone who is maybe smarter than them knows better. And I think that's such a fallacy, because that's not how we built America.
I actually have the opposite fear, and either one of them is bad. We have a government that's supposed to be by the people, of the people, for the people. And if people feel like the government is their adversary and they don't buy into the idea that this is their government, I'm worried that we will just walk away from our system of government willingly. I don't know that anybody's going to come in and take it away from us, but we might just give it up if we don't believe in it anymore. And that's why I, started off talking about the idea that people have to buy into the system. If we don't believe that our government has our best interest at heart, then we're not going to support what the government does. If we're not showing up and getting involved, we're not going to feel like we have any interest in what the government's doing. And that's one of the reasons I've spent so much time in my career on public lands issues. When the people who live the closest to land buy in, in the early days of the Bureau of Land Management, when BLM was managing land for grazers, they felt like they were part of it, and it worked better. Now I talk to grazers and they feel like the BLM comes in and tells them what to do, doesn't listen to them, doesn't care if they survive out there. And that is a very different dynamic that doesn't feel like it's by the people, of the people, or definitely not for the people. It feels adversarial to the people. And what we need is to have the right balance in our government. I don't know that we could live in an unregulated world anymore. I don't know that we're ready to die of things like cholera because of untreated sewage, but we have gone to the other extreme where we're so regulated that the government feels like it's the foe sometimes. And that's what we have to fix.
Well, I love the fact that we elect regular people to represent us in Congress who bring a unique knowledge and experience. I mean, I can't think of the better composition of experience than being a land use attorney and a soil conservationist, to be on the front lines talking about how we use our public lands and how Congress, the federal government, should be interacting with states and locals to best use our land and kind of find the best solutions for that. So I'm so happy that, it seems like our citizen government system is working in that case, and we're bringing the right kind of knowledge to the issues.
I do think it's working. One thing I've learned in my time in my time in Congress, is that the House, especially the United States House of Representatives, is a pretty representative slice of America. We have people from every part of the country, obviously, but we also have people from every education level, a diversity of religions, a diversity of family backgrounds. And you talk to people here, they're pretty fascinating. And as a body, I think we actually represent America pretty well, even though each of us only represents our own district.
I greatly appreciate you coming on the show and talking with us. And I ask you to look out, keep Congressman Jeff Crank on the straight and narrow. I know it's a difficult task, but I really appreciate you coming and talking to us.
I'll keep an eye on him for you. It's my job to tend him this year.
Yeah, the Jeff Wrangler. I love it. So, Congresswoman Celeste Maloy from Utah, we really appreciate it. Folks, if you like this episode and would like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. And always remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Please don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend liberty and freedom. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.